guys got packages at Christmas. You know what was in mine? Stuffed dates. Stuffed dates in Africa under the date bonds. Can you beat that? One good thing about Christmas, you may get homesick, and we did, but you also get Christmas dinner. Fed well at Christmas, including the pets. Along about now, we began to take notice of the kids. First off, they were kind of shy. But Arab kids are no different from the kids back home when it comes to candy. A lot of them looked about half-starved. The Germans had picked the land clean. So we gave half our milk ration to the Red Cross, and they ladled it out. Off duty, we just roamed around, looked, and we saw some mighty strange sights. What the Moorish girls looked like behind the veils. Wondering was about as far as we got. One Sunday, the middle of January, we were hanging around, catching up on the news from home, when we were rooted out for assembly. They told us to polish our brass and shine our leather. Some of us said, "What's the big idea?" Well, we found out. And you could have knocked me over with a tank. It was the Prez himself, riding along in a Jeep. When we saw Mr. Churchill come in, not puffing his cigar, we knew something big was cooking.
In a small seaside hotel at Casablanca, discussions began at once. Their purpose, to design the shape of victory in Africa and beyond. First, a meeting was arranged between Generals de Gaulle and Giraud, who had succeeded Admiral Darlan, assassinated a month earlier. Out of the meeting was to grow the union of the fighting French, who had never lost hope, and the French for whom hope had been reborn. Second, the United Command for the new Tunisian campaign was created. The Allied troops in the area were now predominantly British, but by common agreement, General Eisenhower continued in supreme command. As his deputy commanders, 3 British officers, General Alexander on land, Admiral Cunningham on sea, Air Chief Marshal Tedder in the air. Under them, British, American and French officers and men serving side by side. The whole scheme a dovetailing of command, unique in military campaigns. Third, we fixed the terms which would end the fighting. Unconditional surrender. Of all these decisions, our Russian and Chinese allies were kept fully informed. The conference ended, Mr. Churchill flew on to Tripoli to greet the victorious Eighth Army and explain its vital part in forthcoming events. For the decisive hour was at hand.
Battle lines were drawn. In the north stood the British First Army. In the center, General Giraud's French troops. In the south, the Americans. Further south, a small group of fighting French had completed its historic 1,500-mile march and taken up positions on the left flank of the British Eighth Army, which faced the formidable Mareth Line, behind which barrier Rommel's army, after its long retreat, had entrenched itself. Tunisia was gray with German troops, 15 full divisions. No scratch troops these, but battle-wise veterans of Poland, France, the Balkans. They, together with 7 Italian divisions, were armed with the most modern types of equipment, including the newest fighters and bombers of the German Luftwaffe. The German orders were, hold Tunisia at all costs, keep control of the Mediterranean.
Rommel, standing behind his Mareth Line, saw that he must soon be faced with an attack in the rear from the Allied armies along the Great Dorsal, as well as an assault by the Eighth Army at Mareth. He therefore struck first, in an endeavor to remove the menace behind him. On February the 14th, the blow was struck. Heavy armored columns burst out of Faid Pass in the mountain barrier and through into the valley beyond. In the face of their onslaught, Allied armor withdrew with heavy losses. By the 21st, the enemy had forced his way through the Kasserine Pass, and his armored columns were advancing in a 3-pronged thrust. One main column aimed at Tabessa, our supply base in southern Tunisia, and another at Thala, key town in our lines of communication. Almost within sight of his objective, he was halted. American, British, and French forces all stood immovable against the final impact, and in counterattack, broke it, while Allied air power pounded Rommel's lines of communication and supply. The threat was ended. Advancing past destroyed German armor, we reoccupied Kasserine Pass, and by March the 17th, the original battle lines had been restored. As soon as Rommel saw that his westward thrust was doomed, he made an abortive attack south against the Eighth Army. The Germans unveiled the new Tiger tank, the British the new 17-pounder anti-tank gun. "52 Tiger tanks were left burning hulks. From then on, the initiative was ours."
Of the various strategies which might now be employed against the enemy, General Eisenhower chose one which envisaged the entire military situation in terms of a cylinder. The western wall, Allied land forces along the Great Dorsal. The northern and eastern, Allied air and sea power concentrated in the Mediterranean. The seaports of Tunis and Bizerte were to act as the intake valve, through which those enemy troops that escaped the devastating attacks of planes and submarines based at Malta were to be sucked into the cylinder. At the bottom of the cylinder stood the powerful British Eighth Army to serve as the piston, which in its upward stroke would push the enemy into an ever smaller space. Still in possession of the enemy were certain high hills to the west of Tunis and Bizerte. Their capture was an essential part of the entire strategy, for these hills were the spark plug, which, when the piston had forced the enemy into a state of high compression, would explode the combustible mass. That was the final strategy. To succeed, perfect coordination would be necessary between land, sea, and air forces. The Northwest African Air Force, commanded by General Spaatz, was divided into 5 major groups, of which 3 were combat. The Strategic Air Force, under General Jimmy Doolittle. These were the big boys, the long-range bombers, pounding away at enemy bases and shipping. The Coastal Air Force, under Air Marshall Lloyd. Day and night fighters, these, protecting ports and convoys. And finally, the Tactical Air Force, a new conception of air power developed by the British in the Middle East. All fighters and attack bombers, British and American, were placed under one command so that we could strike with the full force of our flying artillery when and where it would do the most good. Air Marshal Cunningham in command of this group and General Alexander in command of all ground forces lived and worked side by side in a tent camp in the Tunisian mountains. Theirs was a complete partnership, and in it lay the pattern of ultimate victory. By the middle of March, the stage was set. The first move was up to Air Marshal Cunningham. In a continuous 24-hour assault, the Mareth fortifications were pounded from the air. Then General Alexander gave the signal for the piston to begin its upward stroke.
Montgomery, looking ahead, had planned the Mareth battle 3 months before. He would strike after a barrage and in moonlight, as at El Alamein. But simultaneously, he would begin an outflanking movement on the left. The frontal blow had to cross a gorge, the Wadi Zigzag, and create a bridgehead under cover of which tanks and artillery could cross the Wadi before the enemy's counterattack in force could be met. 3 days before the attack, it rained heavily. Next morning, our men were holding on like bulldogs. Only 4 tanks had got across, but with these and their own arms, our infantry kept the bridgehead intact. The enemy, fearing another El Alamein, now withdrew armor from other sectors and threw it in. Whilst this battle raged, our outflanking left hook by General Freyberg and his New Zealanders, reinforced by the 1st Armoured Division, was racing across 150 miles of desert towards El Hamma. The blow was now struck by 50,000 men on the ground and by bombers, fighters and tank busters from the air. The Germans, pinned down by the Northumbrians at Mareth, moved their armor too late. The New Zealanders, thenceforth to be known as the left hookers, drove through.
The Mareth Line had been turned. The piston was on the move, its speed made possible by the feats in road building of the South African engineers. Air and naval forces shelled and bombed all along the seawall. Our fighters struck at their transport planes, still pouring men in through the intake valve, knocking them out of the sky by the hundreds. The British First Army was a constant threat in the north, while in the center, the French had attacked at Pichon, and further south, the Americans had broken through to El Guitar and McNassie, thus enforcing constant pressure all along the land wall of the cylinder. April the 7th, and American patrols of light tanks striking eastward met patrols of the British 8th Army advancing northward.
We got quite a bang out of meeting these guys. 2,000 miles they'd come, fighting all the way. Yes, sir, we got a real bang out of it. These are the guys that broke the back of the Afrika Korps.
Still, the piston pushed relentlessly on. April the 10th, Sfax fell. April the 12th, Sousse. And on April the 20th, after exactly 30 days of fighting in pursuit, the 8th Army had driven the enemy into the hills beyond Enfidaville. And in its wake was a great homecoming.
What got me was watching those villagers coming back. Mostly on little donkeys, piled up with so much stuff you'd wonder how they carried it. Reminded me of the Bible somehow. You know, the donkeys and the hills behind, and these folks trekking home. There was one old chap spoke a bit of English, and he comes up to me and old Joe McAdams, and he says, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And then he started shaking hands with us. I thought he was never going to let go. And as we watched him going down the hill, Joe says to me, he says, "You know, George, I had a buddy killed the other day, and I was pretty sore about it. But now all these poor devils coming home gives the whole thing a kind of a meaning." Well, then when we went down to the village, it was just the same down there. Little Jewish boys taking off the yellow stars they'd been made to wear as if they was lepers. And then our army doctors attending to the women and the youngsters, just as if they was on the panel back home. I certainly felt less browned off. I certainly did.
The rapid advance of the 8th Army had left the American divisions at McNassie and El Guitar far behind the battle area. General Alexander now switched these divisions to the north. This remarkable 200-mile march across the heavy traffic streams of the First Army's lines of supply was accomplished without once interrupting the eastward flow, and this in complete secrecy. The piston had completed its upward stroke. The desired state of enemy high compression had been achieved. Now to capture the spark plug, the vital hills west of Tunis and Bizerte.
This led to a number of major battles, of which 5 were typical. Hill 609, Longstop Hill, Gubelat Plain, Jebel Mansour and Takruna. The 8th Army struck at Takruna. The French 19th Corps attacked Jebel Mansour. On the Gubalat Plain, the British 6th Armoured Division, striking towards Tunis, had drawn upon it most of the enemy's remaining armour. In 3 days of struggle, our main purpose was accomplished, the drawing to this battlefield of von Arnim's tanks and guns and their destruction. Meantime, the British 78th Division was pressing the attack on Longstop Hill. For 12 days, the hills echoed with gunfire. Positions were taken, lost, and retaken. When the German lines broke at last, their dead lay in hundreds, unburied on the battlefields. As our infantry went forward, engineers and pioneers built roads across the mountaintops for vital supplies to reach them. In 14 days, they built 11 miles.
Meanwhile, further north, the Americans had embarked on their phase of the campaign. This started with the assault on Hill 609. Long-range artillery started the attack.
All batteries, left 8. Baker, Baker.
609. There weren't as many of us guys when we got to the top as there'd been at the bottom. But we took it.
Thus, one by one, von Arnim's strongholds in the mountains fell. The Germans had been outfought. Now they were to be outwitted. General Alexander knew their fear of the Eighth Army, so he reinforced that fear with heavy bombardments and local attacks from Montgomery's front. At the same time, he secretly transferred the 4th Indian and the 1st and 7th Armored Divisions from the 8th to the 1st Army in the north, whence the main attack was to come.
The spark plug was ours, and we were now ready to explode the combustible mass. Now to pour on the power. Now to give the apostles of power an education in the use of it. British and Americans in the air with everything that could fly. British and Americans on the ground with everything that could shoot. French artillery, French infantry. British Navy. All poured forth their concentrated fury. This was Blitz warfare such as the inventors of the Blitz had never dreamed of. Challenge to the free world to fight or surrender was being answered. After only 8 hours fighting, the hard crust of German resistance was shattered. Our armor crashed through. The Americans blitzed their way into Bizerte. The British smashed right through the center to capture Tunis. Then a British armored column crashed across the neck of Cape Bon to Hammamet. Another British column raced around the tip of the cape to prevent any evacuation. The whole Axis mass was split into 4 segments. The end came quickly.
By tens, by hundreds, by thousands they came. On foot, in trucks, and behind their bands. The greatest mass surrender of fully equipped troops in modern history. We had lost nearly 70,000 men, dead, wounded, and missing. 35,000 British, 18,000 Americans, 15,000 French. But for every man we had lost, the enemy lost 5. And at the end, 15 full divisions, 266,000 of their best men laid down their arms.
No Bataan this, no Crete, no men riddled with disease and shrunken with hunger, fighting to the last barehanded. Educated in the school for power, they were quick to recognize superior power. And when they did, they quit cold. This is the end of the Axis African adventure.
After all the racket, seems funny, don't it, Joe? So quiet.
Yeah.
What's biting you, Joe?
I don't know. I can't help thinking all the hard work that went into those burnt-out tanks and half-tracks and airplanes. Gone for nothing.
Had to be done.
Oh, sure it did. But still and all, think of all the trucks and automobiles and things all that junk might have been.
I know. Bloody shame.
Just because he was told that he was a Superman.
Well, he never figured things out for himself. Never argued the toss, same as we do. Too bad he didn't hear some of our arguments at the old Dog and Fox back home.
You know, I guess that's the real difference between us and them. We argue the toss, as you say, and they don't.
Yeah, and when you don't argue the toss anymore, you aren't half a man anymore.
Right.
You're just a blooming tool, like a spanner or a saw or a gimlet.
Maybe they like it that way.
Maybe they do, but suppose somebody tried to use you or me like that, Joe. Suppose somebody said put that fella's eyes out or turn a hose pipe on that Jew or on that woman. Would we do it?
What do you think?
You and me, Joe, we may not always think alike, but we do think. You and me and old Alphonse. And the rest, we certainly think all right.
You know, George, I got an idea. Why can't we, after the war, the same work gang, I mean, keep on swinging together? What couldn't we do?
You mean build more houses than ever was?
Yeah, that's it.
And ships, thousands of ships?
Right.
And food so as nobody be hungry no more?
Yeah, building things up instead of blowing things up. Like, I don't know, like dams in the desert and roads through the jungles. Maybe bridges across all the oceans. We could do it, I bet you.
Yeah, do all the jobs that wants doing and knock the block off anybody who wants to start another war. And bring the smiles back to the kids' faces all over the world.
Boy, what a job.
But just now, Joe, it's the same rough road. The same road you and me have just come. The same bloody hard road. And for quite a while yet.
Boy, oh boy, what a job. Bringing back the smiles to kids' faces.
Africa is free, and Europe that much nearer freedom. The liberating hosts are on the wing.